It is my enormous pleasure to be joined for the first time on Bad Faith podcast by Ben Smith. You know him as the founder and editor-in-chief of Semaphore and also as the EIC of BuzzFeed during what I like to refer to as its halcyon days. Welcome to Bad Faith.
Thank you so much for having me on.
No, it's my pleasure for two reasons. One, as we were just sort of reminiscing about, we connected first years ago when I was considering leaving the law. And you reached out to me about potentially doing a podcast over at BuzzFeed,
At
which at the
BuzzFeed, right.
time was like the pinnacle of my sort of imagination for how I could enter the sort of media space and offer up opinions which were leftist in nature and which I felt like didn't really have much of a place to land in the media sphere. And certainly now the media sphere has changed a great deal. I have connected to and been made more aware of the broad kind of bread tube media space. And also the entire world is sort of logged off of the TV and logged on to YouTube, and alternative media is where things are happening. And I'm curious what you make of the shifts that we've seen in the last like 7 or 8 years or so, having yourself sort of been at the helm of these new media enterprises.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, how long you got.
About an hour.
I do think, right. I mean, to me, the basic story is about technology. Like you had, and I think it's sort of easy to forget this because it's just so obvious, but until, 2000, more or less, or a little before, if you wanted to reach a lot of people for the previous 50 years, you needed either to control a broadcast tower or to own a printing press, which were like big and expensive. And so most of us didn't. And and that hadn't, there had not, prior to the birth of broadcast, things had been more complicated and messy and small scale in various ways. But you had this big period where there were 3 television channels, there were big metro newspapers, and cable sort of comes along at the tail end of that period. But that was it. And so that was real consolidation. And it was a really a feature of the way broadcast spectrum worked and how expensive it was to produce television. And the internet, it's so obvious that we all have grown up in it and lived in it and that you can kind of miss it. But the internet just obviously blows that wide open. And in social media kind of continues this fragmentation, this ability to, get any piece of information, any perspective, which is, I think, for those of us who grew up with it, obviously was like incredibly exciting and wide open. And I think, a lot of people I'm 48, people of my generation at least tend to be incredibly utopian about it because we grew up like, wow, we're breaking this monopoly and we can, have much more kind of open conversations. Obviously, at some point, everybody started to hate that. But but it also has, I think, I think my guess is that we're almost at the peak of this fragmentation. Like everybody's got a podcast, everybody's got a Substack. There's so much out there. We all know that there's lots of interesting stuff out there that we're not seeing because we can't find it. I at least have like way too many Substack subscriptions and it's really annoying. It's, I'm subscribed to like 6 different streaming services for entertainment that I never watch. And it's become this very complex, fragmented ecosystem where you're starting to see now. And there's this old saying in media that the media business only does 2 things. It bundles and it unbundles. And we're at the end of a very long period of unbundling. And like, when you announce your acquisition by Rumble next year, that will be a sign that the bundling is coming back, and where everybody's going to be back with paying for 3 subscriptions to 3 networks.
I mean, I wouldn't hold my breath on that, but certainly that is something that, I hear articulated by my audience and, people who do subscribe to a lot of lefty content, that especially I think a lot of left consumers are on the left because they are working class. They don't necessarily feel the ability to subscribe to 5 or 6 or 7 different channels. And I feel, frankly, some pressure to make sure the majority of the content that I put out there is free for that reason. And I frankly relish the idea of having, frankly, people with money footing the bill so that my subscribers don't have to. I mean, I'm a terrible entrepreneur because I do a really bad job of asking people for more money. I want to like choke myself out every time I have to say like subscribe to this podcast at the end of the podcast. And when there were these moments where either because I had an income from Rising or because I had an income from my call-in show, and this relates to our main topic of the evening, which is these sort of tech venture capitalists, dipping their toe into these sort of like political and media spaces. Um, I appreciated it because it took the pressure off of me actually have to gin up money from people, the people who I wanted to hear my content for free because it's a political project and a kind of advocacy project, not a sort of financial project. So
Right,
yeah, go
right,
ahead.
right. It's not a financial project, but of course, like, money is what, keeps the lights on. And, maybe
Sure.
you don't want to say subscribe to my podcast, but like there are probably lots of people who don't know about your podcast. And if you had a huge marketing budget, you could go find them. And so there is this like pressure, I think, to find a business. And, people, I'm sure a lot of your audience is happy to pay and loves the show. And so,
Yeah.
but like,
God bless.
but that shouldn't be like tangled up necessarily in your unwillingness to ask for money. And somebody can come along who's better at asking for money and do that part of the job. And so I do think we're in this moment of all this really interesting, fun, open, fresh stuff, but that's also it's tiring to do it on your own, among other things.
It
And
it is.
and you've worked in and so for a lot of some creators are just like amazing entrepreneurs and love that. But like lots of people in our who are journalists like actually no, they like being journalists. They don't like being entrepreneurs. It sounds like that's maybe slightly more where you're coming from. And so there's got to be I think you'll start to see scaffolding being built in certain ways for that. If it's part of what we're doing, that's definitely part of how we think about semaphores. There's a kind of journalist who breaks a lot of news, is incredibly plugged in. People really listen to them. And they look at Substack and they're like, wow, that's fun and cool. And I wish I had my own voice, but I don't want to do all that stuff. And I want an editor and I want colleagues. And so we've tried to sort of create the best of both worlds there.
Well, and also I think there's something sort of dangerous about it. I personally like having an editor. I like being in community with people. I happened to do an Al Jazeera hit this morning on a panel, and I found myself sort of buzzing afterward and remembering the thrill of battle from Rising and how energizing I find it and how it sharpens you to have to defend yourself. And to engage so directly with many different issues
Hmm.
in a given segment in a given day, and the way that I don't really have to anymore on these episodes that are more narrowly focused than say the like 8 to 10 segments we would do in one given morning on Rising. And I also reflect on, certain people who've been very successful on Substack and other places like that who have been criticized for a certain kind of audience capture and ideological creep that comes from siloing yourself. Maybe it doesn't come from siloing themselves. Maybe these were feelings that people had deep down all along. But certainly that's been part of the criticism. And people who I consider to be ideological bedfellows, watching them get fairly criticized and then also unfairly criticized, and how the mix of the two sort of enables or justifies, I think, for them ignoring it all is a
Yeah.
problem.
It's super interesting you say that because there is something about podcasts, and I host a podcast, Mixed Signals, which I'm just going to plug and hope your folks will check out about these changes in the media, but that they do lend themselves to like vigorous agreement. Like what a great point, Brianna, And like
Yeah.
but if you put
Yeah.
us in a different context, we'd be like arguing really heatedly with each other. And I suspect like that's a thing we both enjoy also.
Yes.
But that's not really what podcasts are for. It's interesting.
I mean, look, for better or for worse, I think there is quite a bit of arguing that still happens on this podcast, including with people who are very ideologically aligned with me. Because I think there are some big ways in which I break from pretty much every political segment that is represented in a meaningful way in the public sphere. And that is at this point being extremely disillusioned with the Democratic Party, such that I half the left disagrees with me on the utility of trying to move the Democratic Party to the left. Certainly all of the Democratic Party disagrees with me on that point. And Republicans all are happy to beat up on Democrats, but for very different reasons than I do. So here we are. I feel very siloed, and I end up getting into these debates like I just did with, a socialist historian Vivek Chibber just last week over this relatively narrow issue. So certainly debates can and do happen, but I do have these questions about how the siloing that happens because not everybody is willing to engage in those kinds of debates ends up affecting political opinion. And that is, I think, the subtext of this recent piece that you wrote for Semaphore, titled The Group Chats That Changed America, in which you profile these group chats as some of the most important affluent members of the tech community and others have been in and the role that they've played in shaping public opinion for years. How did you come to write about this? Give us some background on the nature of the story.
I mean, I guess sort of like travel in fairly different, diverse circles, sort of ideologically, because I'm just a reporter basically, and definitely had this experience a few times of my kind of like center right sources and friends, like saying over lunch, like Mark Andreessen, this is so crazy. Mark Andreessen is blowing up my phone.
Mm.
Um, like this is, this very kind of iconic, very wealthy and venture capitalist who invented the web browser. And
Netscape
at
Navigator.
Yeah, Netscape Navigator, and
Yeah, reading your article and reading the words Netscape Navigator really
it's
took me back.
amazing. And so yeah, and so you're sort of like, wait, what are you talking about? Why is Mark Andreessen blowing up your phone? And I sort of triangulated that, and the people I was talking to weren't all in the same group. It's like, wait, I
Mm.
have multiple sources in different groups, all of them dominated by Mark Andreessen. Like, what is going on? And so started, and then just kind of, you can kind of look at social media and you can guess who's talking to each other, obviously.
Mm.
And actually, I think that's more true than it used to be. That you can tell that people have formed their opinions and formed, consent is being manufactured elsewhere and kind of exported onto social media. Um, and so I basically started guessing who was in these groups, and mostly was correct because you can just kind of tell who's all talking to each other and saying the same stuff. Um, like if you just sort of look at like everybody who sort of attacks Taylor Lorenz on Twitter, like they're all in the same chat group, it turns out. So so
That's
I
a that's a
started.
that's a crazy signpost, by the
Yep,
way.
there
I
you
mean,
go.
it seems very obvious. I've often wondered to myself why this one journalist, whatever you think of the content of her coverage, or whether or not you agree with the emphasis on whatever it is, why she, a relatively inoffensive person, has attracted quite so much ire. And you're saying that part of it is that
Yeah, I don't mean it was a conspiracy. It's just like they all like got obsessed. In the way that you do with your friends in a group chat, you like get obsessed with somebody and then you like develop some huge theory among yourselves about them. And
and
they
you create a sort of
and,
permission structure to hate something or
oh,
someone.
totally, totally. But you also develop a kind of narrative and like an inside joke about someone. And I think that's what that was. But in any case, so I basically started reporting it out and pretty quickly realized there were these kind of Mark Andreessen had two aides essentially in different moments who had started a series of group chats for him. First in the beginning of COVID, when a lot of people, but certainly a lot of these venture capitalists, felt like both social media and Slack had gone insane, that they were getting all this pressure from their employees, in particular, actually in Slack, to, for instance, post Black Lives Matter flags, and they didn't want to, but they didn't know how to say no, or whatever kind of progressive social thing that they were against, but felt like they couldn't say to the people they employed that they were against, and so were commiserating about this in these WhatsApp groups that Andreessen Horowitz started. I mean, also just gossiping about technology, starting runs on Silicon Valley Bank, all sorts of other stuff. It wasn't just politics. Um, at all. But then and then another, and this guy Sriram Krishnan, who's now at the White House, started those groups for Andreessen. There are dozens of them, and then around each like a one for AI, one for space, one for engineering, and then another guy, Eric Torenberg, a podcaster, started a bunch of other groups more around politics. And what I found was that initially Andreessen had been in a group with these Harper's Letter liberals, Thomas Chatterton Williams and Camille Foster and Yasha Monk, among others. And then eventually, and he liked the Harper's Letter, liked the sort of pushback against social media speech fights. Then got bored of these liberals just kind of wringing their hands about speech anymore. And Chris Rufo, a conservative activist who was in that group, and he eventually basically threw them, like that group melted down because they were sick of the liberals talking about speech and not being focused on crushing their enemies. Um,
And what you mean by talking about speech is that they had a consistent perspective as pro free speech advocates, as free speech absolutists, as opposed to an ideologically motivated one. And when Thomas Chatterton Williams and some of the others pushed back against some of the campus censorship that was happening at the time, they were upset.
yes, and that was the falling out. They wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying that while they didn't like critical race theory, the government shouldn't be banning it. And that's where that ended. And Rufo told me that he thought that was actually a very valuable lesson for the tech community, that like these liberals aren't reliable. They're not really interested in power. They just want this nonsense ideological speech stuff. And so then he made new friends. He reached out to this guy, Richard Hanania, who's a conservative Republican academic with a complicated past, that involves being super racist, which he has disavowed. Um,
Yeah.
who basically Andreessen knew him a little and reached out and said, "Hey, can you make me a group with some smart right wing people? Because I want to learn more." And they did that. And then eventually, about a year later, he and Hanania have a falling out because Hanania, I think it can be kind of an annoying guy. So that maybe that was the Andreessen camp's view of this, kept pestering Andreessen about why he was cool with Trump saying he'd won the 2020 election, among other annoying habits. And so they had a falling out, and that group falls apart, and onward, kind of rightward for the tech guys.
So repeatedly, the trend that I'm hearing emerge is that
Sorry, that group didn't fall apart though. That group's still going, just without him. Anyway.
okay, so these groups are coalescing around what I think are publicly acceptable and even publicly vaunted principles like free speech. But the part that seems to require the group chat and then like subsequent group chats that exclude people that are insufficiently smart, I guess, are these other sorts of issues like being openly prioritizing power as opposed to the free speech principle, or saying, as much as I might be a Republican and like Donald Trump, I don't think it's politically advantageous or accurate to be an election denialist. Can we talk about this? No, we have to have a new group chat, or at least distance ourselves from Hanania in the group chat.
Yeah, and I think there was a sense of like, hey, we're trying to get something done here. We're trying to like get the revolution done. Like, stop yammering about this stuff. We're trying, like we're trying to win the political fight. I mean, it's not that simple, and there's lots of personality stuff too. But the other thing that you're, I think, referring to is the final chat in a way was this one called Chatham House, which is huge, and it turned out I knew a bunch of people who were in it, 100, 300 some people, and many of them just spending their days fighting with Mark Cuban, which is whatever, a whole other story, who is also in it. I texted him after the story. He wouldn't comment on the story. And he was like, yeah, I was actually, I don't even know who half the people I'm fighting with are. They're just, numbers. And he's just responding in this group. But in any case, that group sort of, I think lost steam a bit when David Sachs, who's now the White House crypto and AI advisor, basically after Liberation Day, most of these people are primarily entrepreneurs and business people, not political people. And I think just hadn't realized that when Trump said he was going to do tariffs, he was going to do tariffs, and were shocked and appalled that this guy who they supported for president did not turn out to be a free trader, which is very important to them. And because they manufacture in China, et cetera. And so they started denouncing him, and David Sachs then says to one of the organizers of the chat, like, this is terrible. You all have Trump derangement syndrome. You need to make me a new chat with smarter people. Meaning, of course, people who agree with him.
Right. So, okay. One of the, I think, most interesting questions that is raised by this article is what purpose the private chats are serving when initially the idea seems to have been that the public sphere was hostile to Republicans, that liberals owned all of the social media outlets, and that there was a cancel culture amok, and that we needed a safe space. They needed a safe space to talk about controversial ideas. You have back in the day, Barry Weiss coining this term intellectual dark web, which featured many of the same figures that are featured in this article, who were ostensibly taking positions that were sort of unsanctioned by the mainstream. And it didn't, at least from my perspective as a leftist, there were aspects of this that had a sort of
Yeah, you must have felt that.
nonpartisan.
You must have felt
Yes.
that a bit, right? You were always really hostile to identity politics at moments when that was not an acceptable position, right?
Well, I would characterize it a little bit differently. I was critical of the weaponization of identity for cynical means, the way that the Democratic Party principally weaponized it against left politics. And I think there's something really instructive about one of the examples from this piece that you just mentioned about the Black Lives Matter iconography and whether or not people should be like forced or pressured into
Yeah, like I feel like
displaying it.
you would have loved that group chat. You would have been.
I would have been one of the critics because I mean I remember at the time I have no issue with people putting anything on their profile, whether it's pronouns or a pride flag or Black Lives Matter or anything like that. I personally never have, just because it has felt very performative. And my concern has been that a sort of easy performative liberal expression of one's politics can be both irritating because it seems I think people can feel how performative it is, and also ineffective. It's useless. And so it has the effect of undermining genuine efforts for racial equality, reining in police and justice, all of those kinds of things, LGBT rights, etc. It has the effect of alienating the masses while doing absolutely nothing for the core constituency groups it's supposed to
Right,
help.
and that's a view that would have got you yelled at on Twitter in 2020. And
But that's the thing. I said it in 2020, and I said it in 2017, and I said it in 2015.
totally, but like people like you and me have like a pretty high pain tolerance for getting yelled at by strangers in the internet.
Sure.
But I don't fault people who don't. And like I don't think that the premise that like having all of your conversations in an open air insane asylum of Twitter is like maybe a little bad. Like I get the retreat to group chats actually. I mean, I do think that's why they went there because that was sort of it was genuinely unpleasant to try to have some of these conversations for normal for and these are actually very sensitive guys, almost all guys who
Oh, poor things.
well no, but like these tech guys like this was like they live more of their lives more digitally than most people. And so like
Hey,
digital criticism like they are
I
very sensitive to it. You see it with Elon, like he's totally lost his mind on there.
or
I'm
been they're
not really
sensitive
justifying, I'm
because
just explaining.
no, but to armchair psychologize this for a second, they might be sensitive because they're digital people and they live in a digital world, and so they're especially sensitive to digital media. But it also could be that they're the richest people in the world who, for decades, have been surrounded by nothing but yes people, and who are genuinely raw, um, and have no shield against critique. And so I got to say, I don't think that it's their diagnosis is incorrect, that these people are sensitive. I mean, whomst amongst us can forget when Dave Chappelle brought Elon Musk on the comedy stage with
Oh,
him, and he got booed, and the man looked like he was genuinely confused as to what,
and
like
hurt.
aliens had landed in front of him. Like he couldn't process the idea that someone didn't like him, because I don't think that he believes that anybody does. He's not exposed to this sort of thing.
Yeah, but so some of it is that psychology for sure.
That being said, I gotta say, as someone who's not a billionaire or a millionaire, um, and who has of public opinion, including, as I alluded to at the top of this, like even within my own sort of ideological cohort, I have very little sympathy for people who are rich enough to literally buy Twitter and make it in their own image in order to insulate themselves from real opinion and public opinion and truth bombs. And now, especially that Twitter and all of so many of these social media platforms are skewing to the right, or I think that's probably understating the case.
Yeah.
They're still in these group chats.
Yeah, and I think actually, Andreessen talked about this on a podcast recently. He didn't talk to me. He doesn't.
Mm.
I think these guys sort of have disengaged from journalism, but he about how like he thinks he basically. I mean, his view, though he's also I think kind of addicted to these chats, but his view is this is bad. It would be better. It's better to do this stuff in public. It was sort of an emergency measure, but now that Elon has bought Twitter and now that Substack is thriving and podcasts are everywhere, it's better to be out in the open than in group chats. Which I'm not even sure that's true either. I think Twitter made us all insane. So who knows?
Do you really believe that it might be better to have these conversations happening in group chats? Again, given the nature of what I think the group chats, the kind of conversations that are happening in the group chats.
I mean, I think the tendency toward like real groupthink, you sort of it happens in public social media, it happens in private chats. Um, I mean, again, I don't. These chats served a very particular purpose of creating this alliance between the tech industry and Donald Trump, which is its own political project. I don't really mean to comment on that, but I do think there is obviously something to be said for trying to work out your views in a kind of more charitable environment. And I think actually the culture has shifted. These podcasts are much more like that. Like I'm probably not going to get in huge trouble if I say something slightly dumb to you now. I hope.
Well, okay, but for one, I'm curious about this idea of not especially wanting to weigh in on the sort of consensus, the influence campaign, the Trump of it all, because that does seem in some ways to be the whole story. I mean, I spoke to an
It's why it's
economist
important.
recently. Yeah, I spoke to an economist on the show recently, Fidel Kaboob, whose read on tariffs, and whose read more on the sort of tech Trump alliance has a great deal to do with the tech industry's frustration with the Biden administration and Lena Khan, and the fact that so many of the European countries that were impacted by these tariffs have more rigorous kind of anti-monopoly laws and the like that threaten the tech industry. And they felt like Biden wasn't doing enough to protect American tech monopolies, and they were willing to throw their lot in with the other side. So to the extent that that is part of a story that I would argue is being dramatically undercovered, I don't think I had really heard that angle until I talked to Professor Kaboub. And the public is
I like a good
increasingly
Marxist
frustrated.
analysis. This is what I come here for.
I'm glad to hear that, Ben.
Don't get that enough in Washington.
You don't. And then
Sure.
I gotta say, heading a publication like Semaphore, it's an interesting question as to the why not? Because the entire country seems to be waking up to what I would argue is a materialist view on contemporary politics. Conservatives are frustrated with with Donald Trump because of the way that his tariff campaign is hurting the economy.
Yeah, that is the funniest part that they actually wound up like conspiring together to elect Bernie Sanders. I mean, that is sort of a funny outcome.
What do you mean? Who's
On the
conspiring?
tariff and anti-front front, they weren't these tech guys like they weren't paying a lot of attention to the details. It did turn out to help elect a guy who has a view on trade that is just really, really different from small L liberals, small C conservatives. Like he's not interested in, he really doesn't think free trade is a good thing and is trying to restrict it in a lot of different ways, which, you know, I don't right or left. Like there's some sort of horseshoe thing going on and he's out there. And then specifically, I agree with you. I don't think antitrust was the biggest. I don't think it was as big a factor as the academic you talked to, partly because a lot of these VCs, like they're mostly now betting on companies that are challenging the big monopolies. And so it's complicated. Like Silicon Valley, a lot of the Silicon Valley investments are in the small companies. Like that's where, because if you're a VC, you're starting with the small stuff. And so obviously Google and Meta were very upset about Europe, but it's a complicated picture out there. And but in any case, Trump has put in people who are much closer to Lena Khan than to the Google point of view, which again, I'm not sure. I think that may be a little by accident. I don't think Trump has particularly like focused on this, but it is kind of they did, if that's what they were paying for, they did not get what they paid for.
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument is they thought it was going to be like Trump term one, where Trump ran and campaigned on the sort of a kind of right populist vision, but ended up staffing up with folks who were very much establishment.
Yeah.
And I think
Surprise.
the argument, the critique, or maybe the benefit, depending on how you see it, of Trump too, is that he figured out how to keep the people near him that were more ideologically similar to him,
Or just who would do what he
including in the
wanted. Like
foreign
ideology is a
policy
big
realm.
word for, yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, people who would do what he wanted. I would say ideology is like a real big word for a lot of what is happening at the moment because some of it is sort of,
Why?
because some of it is impulse. A lot of it is like there was a debate over whether they should break up Facebook. And I think the terms of the debate were like, Mark Zuckerberg hates you, so you should screw him.
Okay, so this is interesting. I do think that another piece of the puzzle is Trump's kind of personality, his capriciousness, the fact that he's like this kind of classic dynamic Gemini who, who's going to do what he wants to do. I mean, the stars don't lie. But I think that's
I've not heard
all.
that before, but I like it.
Look, I did an episode, I think at some point like a year or two ago, where I had an astrologer come in and go down the whole it was like during the primary that wasn't season, and analyze every candidate in the mix. And half of my audience was furious at me. But I will be doing it again. So gird yourself, folks. Love that kind of analysis. But yeah, some of it is personality driven for sure. But I guess I bristle because I do think there's sometimes a liberal tendency to want to ref dispute, to reject the idea that there's any ideological consistency or any ideological thread that is not just motivating Donald Trump, but which can be read by the public that supports him and by the base that supports him.
Hmm.
And I think if you acknowledge it, even if Donald Trump is not always very purposeful, even if he's litigating the trade war in a way that's ineffective and ultimately is going to hurt the American working class and not help the American working class the way that a different kind of trade policy, anti-free trade policy, protectionist policy could, that at least he is making the sort of broad gestures of America first that remember for years back in the 2016, 2017, after his first win, the mainstream media, the liberal media was completely um, unwilling to acknowledge that there was a there. If you said, I'm sure you remember this, Ben, if you said back in 2017, um, people voted for Donald Trump because of economic populism, because of economic precarity.
Right.
Remember when people were using that
Right. It was
that
like, no, no, they're all
terminology?
racist. Yeah, that was
No, no,
the
they're all
response.
racist. And the what's his name? Ta Coates of it all and the Atlantic of it all were saying that anybody who took an opposing view just hated black people and didn't care about, ethnic minorities, didn't care about a Muslim ban. Like,
Right.
the Trump was obvious about what he was going to do, and you're just indifferent to the interest of poor of minorities
Yeah.
if you say that it was anything other than racism. And now slowly there's a come to Jesus moment.
Totally. And I get you right. There's a MAGA ideology, as you say. Trump isn't the perfect vessel for it and has a lot of kind of competing impulses. I mean, I think the most interesting, and I think Steve Bannon actually has managed to position himself as like the true vessel of that and has kind of like thought it through.
Yes.
Um, it's kind of, I mean, and that's a very war room, very interesting show to listen to. But I think one of the things that he's obsessed with, and I interviewed him at our with this World Economy Summit in DC a couple weeks ago, or last week, that I brought him over there because I want to interview him about taxes because one obvious consequence of this ideology is you should tax the rich. Like it just,
Yes.
it's a different economic perspective and it just falls out obviously from the where they're coming from. And they also, want to close the deficit, like all the it's just and so Trump, Bannon has been hammering that, and you're just and now Trump is like he said to the Senate leadership, like, hey, we should think about taxing the rich. I think the Republican Party, as it's currently constructed, just can't do that. Like these legislators just won't do that. But I do think that's the direction of travel.
I mean, this is where the rubber hits the road and what's so fascinating. And I mean, so I was on this Al Jazeera panel this morning with a woman from Third Way, and just sort of left of I don't want to mischaracterize them, but sort of still in the Democratic Party, but maybe Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren left a historian, and we were agreeing, me and the historian, on a lot of things, except for I'm kind of in a post Democratic Party mind frame. But what's so interesting when you're in the mix with someone like someone from Third Way, a neoliberal think tank that has been pushing the sort of ideology that the Democratic Party has been following for the last most of my life, 30 years or so, um, is that you keep getting to this point where everyone agrees, okay, Joe Biden lost. That was very, very bad. Donald Trump is very, very bad and doing very, very bad things. Everyone's mad at him now. Even among Republicans, his approval rating is down because occasionally the interest of working people and the interest of moneyed elites align, and everybody's mad that the economy is crashing. Okay. So how do the Democrats take advantage of this moment? And the Third Way folks, same as what you're hearing from James Carville and the like, are doubling down on the don't do anything. Uh, just let Donald Trump dig his own grave. Hakeem Jeffries, this broke today news that he was mad at Chris Van Hollen from going to El Salvador, and has said no more Democrats should go and do the enthusiasm generating act of standing up for due process and our
Right.
Constitution by opposing Trump's deportations. And I'm going back and forth on this show because I'm like, the Democratic Party has a credibility issue. You can't say you are anti-oligarch and anti-self-dealing the way that Trump is doing and aligning with all of these tech billionaires when you have your own oligarchs that are going to run a JB Pritzker or a Gavin Newsom. You can't say that you are for kitchen table issues when you have someone like Joe Biden who couldn't get a $15 minimum wage across the table. And in fact, as I've talked about in detail on this show, orchestrated it being pulled out of the American Rescue Plan, where it could have passed via budget reconciliation. You can't have these principled stands against even some of the free speech oppression on college campuses when you have a Democratic Party that is fully aligned with Israel, who all of the students are protesting. And so you have something like Cory Booker willing to protest for 25 hours on the Senate floor without actually saying the name of his own constituent who's been rounded up because of his pro-Palestine speech. And so, sorry, go ahead. I see you. I
No,
see you
it's interesting.
thinking.
I mean, I was just thinking, do you ever worry that like, I mean, that in some sense Trump is going to wind up sort of accidentally discrediting kind of lefty economics to the degree that he indulges in it? Like, I think what you saw in Canada, which was so fascinating, was, Mark Carney is like, if you wanted to find a neoliberal globalist, like he was the governor of a central bank, but not their central bank, like a different central bank in England. And the attacks on him, like, which I thought were going to work, were like, you are a bug-eating Davos elite who, again, like, was the governor not of our central bank, but of a different central bank. Like, that is as out of touch, elite, kind of globalist neoliberal as you get. And instead, his answer to that was, no, I actually understand how the system works. Look what happens when you elect populists who don't. They are clowns, and you need an elite. You need like a neoliberal elite to run the thing, or else it'll just literally fall apart
I
the
think
way it
liberals
is in
will
the U.S.
try.
And it's kind of interesting. I mean, it worked. Like it worked very well and got him elected yesterday.
Yeah, I think that liberals definitely they tried that after 2017, 2016, right? They have been saying horseshoe theory and screaming up Bernie Sanders ever since then.
Yeah.
Even though now they finally capitulated to the idea that he's the only one who can get a crowd out with tens of thousands of people coming out to these rallies, because no matter what the elites say and their narrative building, regular people really understand the top down much more than they do the left right. And if there
Hmm.
weren't such a, I think, consensus among the mainstream journalism establishment, frankly, Bernie would have won both of his presidential races, and we never would have had a Donald Trump. We would have had the press honestly covering the fact that Bernie Sanders was the number one candidate with independent and swing voters, both in 2016 and in 2020. Instead of fear mongering about the idea that there were these Obama to Bernie to Trump voters and saying that was evidence that somehow Bernie Sanders was a fascist, the press could have honestly reported that that was part of his electability argument and would have gotten behind him in 2020. And again, we never would have had this second, we'd be on term two of Bernie Sanders instead of term two of Donald Trump. I mean, and I have to put this to you, Ben, because I haven't exactly seen a lot of sort of pro-left populist messaging in the public sphere, including in Semaphore. And I really appreciate Dave Weigel. He's been on the show. He obviously writes for Semaphore now.
Yeah, actually, I think he brings in. I mean, he's our main national political reporter and brings in
Yes,
a
and
ton
he's
of
been
voices from the
covering the
left.
left. He's been covering the left, diligently since what the Washington since he was at the Washington
Since he
Post.
was at Reason magazine, I believe.
Since he was a reason I forgot about that as well. But he understands the left, I think, much better than most people who gain access to mainstream publications. But I do wonder, I mean, how does this sound to you? Because to me, I think there's a lot of people on the left who would be open to having a less hostile relationship with establishment Democrats if at least there was some like accountability, at least if there was some kind of acknowledgement that we called it. We've been calling it for 8 years. And if the Democratic Party had taken up our prescriptions instead of doubling down on the third way and trying to make Elise Slotkin the face of the party and Liz Cheney the face of the party, that we might not have been in this place. And I do wonder how you're reflecting on the
Yeah, I mean, I'm
role
not, I'm
that
not a Democrat, and I'm not like that political. I mean, I'm a journalist, and our sort of ethos is very much like we really do want we have an audience that wants to understand how Bernie supporters think, want to understand how Trump supporters think, doesn't want to be lied to, but isn't looking to us to sort of like emotionally charge their political commitments, basically. Like, and I think there's like enough of that out there. But honestly, but do think that like every I mean this is obviously kind of an annoying cliche, but also everybody thinks that all their views have been vindicated, right? Like I mean, and I think the thing that you hear right now from the sort of neoliberals, which I'm not sure is really that true either, but is that Biden kind of let the Bernie and Warren people into the economic policy apparatus. That
I think
is a
that's
lot
true
of
in
what
part.
alienated these Silicon Valley guys. Like if you think that some butterfly flapped its wing, Elon Musk wound up supporting Trump, and that's why Trump won. I do not, by the way, believe that. Actually, I think Elon is sort of overrated in that. But like the butterfly that flapped its wing is probably Bernie or Elizabeth Warren.
I think that's true, but alienating the Silicon Valley elite is not the same thing as losing an election. And I think
No, I
it
agree with
is
you.
true. It is true that that
But
is the best thing that Biden did, and that was also when his popularity was peaking.
yeah,
His popularity peaked during the first 2 years when they were doing all of the COVID spending and people were getting money in their pockets and they felt like government was doing something good. And then his numbers plummeted when all of those policies that were designed to fail and designed to lapse did in fact lapse. And
and when
he
inflation
was
hit.
running on, I did something nice 2 years ago under the constraint of a pandemic and inflation. Yeah, absolutely. Without acknowledging also that inflation was real and happening. And again, not getting behind policies that he had committed to and that the Democratic Party platform commits to, like a $15 minimum wage, which obviously should be much higher now because we're in the longest period of time since the advent of the minimum wage without there being a raise in the minimum
Mm.
wage. What I'm saying is
You've got
that
my
while
vote.
everybody might think that their views are validated by history, I think the left is right about that.
Yeah, no, I mean,
Oh,
I'm not. I guess I'm not like I'm not going to argue with you about this. Like, I don't. I'm not. I don't feel like I'm sure.
so what do you make then of I saw Semaphore has covered this, even if you didn't write about this specifically, the battle that's happening within the Democratic Party with David Hogg. He is, of
Yeah,
course, the DNC vice chair who recently announced that he was forming a PAC to raise money for young challengers to Democratic Party incumbents, wanting there to be a shakeup. We have Rep. Connolly, who won this committee position over AOC despite being about 80 years old and
yeah. I
having
saw that Eleanor Holmes
cancer.
Norton who's 88, is going for a leadership position, and Dave just broke that there's sort of an insurgency against Hogg. I mean, what's so interesting about this is like, it does seem like there's this very real, and it's like, what do you? It's interesting. Like, I'm curious what you think, because there's obviously this sense among Democrats of like, we need people who will go out and fight.
Hmm.
We want younger, more dynamic candidates. There's, people are comparing it to the Tea Party, which was interpreted at the time as ideological, as being kind of libertarian, anti-tax, but really wound up, I think, if you reassess it, was more populist, was more Sarah
Hmm.
Palin, Donald Trump, culture war, whatever that is. It wasn't so ideological. It wasn't ideological in a way that it was being understood at the time. And I think I'm struggling. And I think a lot of the like impulse in the Democratic Party toward like, we got to get rid of Schumer and replace him with somebody who's going to fight. Um, I guess I can, I guess I'm not sure whether I think that's ideological or not. Like, do they want somebody who is to Schumer's left, or do they just want somebody who's like looks and feels more like John Fetterman? Like, I'm not
I think
sure.
it's the latter, and that's a problem. This is why I don't have confidence in the Democratic Party. Chuck Schumer's
But these are the
impotence.
voters. We're not talking about like the party elites. They don't
Oh,
exist.
well,
Like, we're talking
the
about just like
voters, I think, want a real fight. The polls are obvious about what the voters want. 88% of Democratic voters want Medicare for all. $15 minimum wage is overwhelmingly popular. You want to do kitchen table issues? You want to
right, but
address
the
the fact that
current
people are feeling
revolt isn't driven
inflation?
by those policy issues. The current
No, but
revolt is driven
this
by
is but
like,
this is what
we
I'm
want
getting
somebody
at.
who will fight Donald Trump.
Sure, but if you think that Donald Trump won, if you acknowledge, I think you just did, that Donald Trump won in part because of inflation and this idea that people are feeling precarious, then you have to offer policy prescriptions that actually address those core issues, not but we like immigrants and black people and LGBT, which is what the Democratic parties have been hoping well is enough to get people over the finish line
Hmm.
because it is nice to like those things, but when people are feeling precarious, and suddenly it's like maybe I don't like immigrants so much anymore, and maybe the LGBT stole my job, and maybe I got fired because I wasn't woke enough, and that's how you create these sorts of hostilities, I would argue. So I think that there are structural reasons, right, why the Democratic Party will only accept a fake fighter, not a real fighter. They'll accept someone who looks like John Fetterman, or people who curse a lot. There's been this epidemic of cursing Democrats because again, these superficial things. You're allowed to say the F bomb, but you're not
Right.
allowed to say tax the
Totally.
rich. You're allowed to
That
wear
worked
all
for Trump
black
too,
and
by the way.
sit. Well, yes, but like his core sort of ideological desires. I mean, his number one achievement during his first term was a tax cut for the rich. So there's an alignment of
Right.
interest between right populist or right, at least a right kind of faux populist and what their base will tolerate, and the economic interests, the
Yeah.
corporate interest, in a way that doesn't exist on the left, which is where identity politics comes in. That's the role that identity politics is serving, is distracting the left-leaning public, the liberal public, from realizing that there's more similarities between Republican and Democratic leadership than they imagine there being. The photo through the window of the White House of Chuck Schumer hugging Donald Trump immediately after Donald Trump was inaugurated, right? Like that's the reality of our political system. And the Democratic Party's role, I would argue, is to obscure that reality and make people feel like there really are two parties, one of which is a resistance party. But the only resistance I think we're going to get from the Democrats, the only thing that will stomach, is Cory Booker's posturing, or he and Jeffries wearing all black like they're NWA on the doing like a rap photo shoot on the steps of Congress. Like that's it. And that's why you get, and maybe you can put some clips of this in if I can find them. I've been like really listen to what Democrats say about the AOC and Bernie rallies, some of them will outwardly criticize them, but most of them will say, I'm glad they're fighting. I'm glad that they've got energy back into the party. I disagree, though, about the messaging. I disagree what they're fighting about. I don't like the term oligarchy.
I appreciate the spirit. Okay. So don't get me. I appreciate the spirit of those that are going around on protests calling oligarchs. You're all over California. How many people you've been a lieutenant governor, governor? How many times has somebody come up to you and said oligarch? Rather than rich or big, fat special interests. Okay. Why don't we use terms that people at the diner
understand?
Okay. Well, I didn't know we were applying for our tenure position.
What I do give Bernie credit for is I like the energy around some of the things they're doing, but his message is not the right one. He has elements of it. Can you imagine if they talked about building housing for the working poor and providing people with tax breaks for people who the houses were built for? We helped them get a down payment on that house, but they had to work, and if they didn't, we'd yank it from them. That's a Trump idea. Can you imagine if we said to people who are giving to these big universities, Democrats saying, we don't think it's right to give to Harvard and Yale and get the same breaks as you would if you give to a local organization with an endowment less than $1 million.
It's a very conditional praise that makes it clear to me that the party is not going to embrace them substantively ever.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there is this. I mean, I guess I'm less persuaded. I'm obviously less of a committed Marxist than you are, but
less or not at all.
but I do think that I think that a lot of Democrats are who are not that who may wherever they are ideologically are like very freaked out about the rule of law and the procedural democracy stuff, and that's pretty motivating. And and I think Trump's view actually is in some ways closer to yours, which is people don't really care about this role of the court system. They care about like getting rid of this Salvadoran guy who's a bad guy. And I don't know how that plays out politically, but I think so much of the energy right now is coming from the sense that Trump is defying the courts, not that he's going to cut Medicaid.
Well, I think that's true too. But you have the leader of the House Democrats saying no more going to El Salvador to advocate for the people who have been deported without due process. That's the scoop of the day, that the Democratic Party's priority is to see the one person doing the good thing that generates confidence with the public and say, quit that. Stop talking about that. That's not a fight we're going to fight. And there's been other people, I think maybe it was also Carville, who, I don't quote me on that, but at least one other Democrat who very publicly came out against the idea that that the Democrats should be aligning themselves with the deportees. I think they're afraid that there's going to be somebody who actually did a little bit of a bad thing, even if it's just a traffic violation, and that they're going to get pegged as being soft on crime Democrats who love criminals and are going to stand by them. I mean, that's certainly the narrative that Republicans are trying to build. I would argue the problem with Democrats is that while Christopher Rufo is in this chat, ultimately trying to program the richest men in the world to align with his political views, doing active persuasion, teaching the entire country what CRT means, or at least what he wants CRT to mean.
Right.
Democrats will take a winning issue like once upon a time being up on the public perception of who can handle immigration better, or who can handle the economy better, or dreamers being good and we should be nice to them and save them and keep their parents from being deported and give them citizenship, to completely ceding that ground, not doing any persuasion, doing a poll trying to chase Republicans to the right, and then being shocked when people want the real version of Republicans and not Republicans light in the form of the Democratic Party.
I mean, I just don't know. I'm not sure that's the politics of this moment, though. It just doesn't seem like. I think that it's a moment of like. I mean, maybe it's just this force field that Trump creates around sort of being his ability to elevate these very kind of personality driven and very kind of specific conflicts. But I don't. I mean, but I think to the degree that there's the politics of the economy, it's what you said before. There's like an unusual alignment between between different strata of society and not want to destroy the economy.
What do you attribute the enormous popularity of the anti-oligarch rallies, which, to be clear, are in red districts?
And when you say anti-oligarch rallies, you mean the anti-Tesla stuff?
No, the AOC Bernie rallies are getting tens of thousands of people showing up in Trump districts in places like Utah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I totally agree with you. That's something people have kind of missed and always kind of missed about Bernie, that there's a huge number of Americans who love him and love his message. Um, but these are rallies that are nowhere near the size of the marches on Washington in Trump's first term that wound up having really like no political meaning or effect. So I don't
Well,
know.
no, I mean, that's a big march on Washington. And I agree that there's limited utility
Like
to the marches
I
to
don't really
actually
know. I mean, I
change
agree with you
things.
that I mean I think you're right that there are a lot of people who love Bernie's message and are really progressive and maybe they could win him, I don't know, is there a socialist out in Utah who you think could win the Senate? Like I don't really think so. It's a big
Why
country.
not? Well, first of all, they don't have to be a socialist. The
A
commitments that Bernie
Democrat.
is running on
Yeah.
are Democratic Party principles ostensibly.
Right.
They just don't do them. So, like, I don't think you have to be a socialist to think that there should be a minimum wage that has not been the same since 2009. I don't think you have to be a socialist to support universal health care the way that 88% of registered Democrats do, right? Like, I don't think you have to be a socialist to not want
Yeah,
to
I'm
to
not arguing with
arm
you here.
to arm Israel. So that's the thing. But then, like this kind of slipperiness is exactly rhetorically what happens anytime an issue like this comes up. There becomes this sort of circling the wagons around the Democratic Party as though Bernie Sanders and AOC and whomever are the enemy instead of the last survivors trying to lead the Democratic Party out of
No,
the
I mean,
wilderness that they
what I
built
think
for
is interesting
themselves.
is like I think you could imagine, and maybe I'm wrong, but a Democratic Party where you have that is like John Fetterman and AOC, right? Like I think voters are
Why?
really interested in a kind of style of candidate who can
What's
really fight.
Fetterman's value add? What's his value add to that ticket?
Oh, I don't mean that's a ticket. I just mean that
Or to
like
that
that the kind of candidate who the
team?
kind of Democrat who seems to be winning is more combative, is lives in a sort of contemporary media world, but those are stylistic things,
Ben.
not substantive things, right?
And I don't think John Fetterman will win his next election
Or maybe signifies that they, and then obviously this was much truer of him when he ran the first time, but basically like carries class
because
signifiers
he
that
was
people like.
pretending to be he's an extremely affluent man from an extremely
Did you
affluent
dislike him at the
family.
time, or has this like kind of grown on you? As
Well, I
did
certainly
you never buy it?
well, I think there was always some I personally and I think Sabby Sab is one of the few people who was on this from the beginning. I
Hmm.
think there was always some not not broadly, but there was some suspicion of him because of that story about how he chased down that black guy with a gun.
Oh yeah,
I gotta say, that was
yeah,
always
not
out there.
great.
That being said, if I recall the details of his race correctly, it was that he won his primary and then he had the stroke, and then there was no time for an alternative, and no one wanted Dr. Oz to win, and so there was a lot of defending of him, including from myself, because it was important to win that seat, right? It was important to win that Senate seat. So I certainly was a part of that. And I don't think it was clear at the time, especially pre October 7th, the extent to which he was going to remake himself and his entire personality as not just sort of defending Israel, but he's like a senator. He might as well be a senator from Tel Aviv. People have done accountings of what his tweet ratios are like, and he like 75% of everything he's tweeted in the last year has something to do with Israel. It's his entire personality. He's had staffers quit. There's been story after story, probably some of which covered by Semaphore, about the revolts at his offices,
Hmm.
because he was staffed by a lot of leftists who feel very differently on that issue and who just couldn't stomach being around him anymore. And I think the cosplay of him being an extremely affluent person who thinks that the optics of wearing a sweatshirt are a replacement for having a personality and a political perspective that actually fights for the working people in his own state. A state, by the way, that has a federal minimum wage, has the 2009 federal minimum wage, is very distasteful. So no, I think, senators get to be in there a long time, but I think he's going to have a very rude awakening when he actually has to defend his record.
Yeah, in the Democratic primary, you're probably right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry,
I mean, what do you
I'm
make
just
of that?
agreeing with you here. I'm
I mean,
no good at
but this is
this.
I I confess that there's a part of me that's like, oh, I've got Ben Smith sitting in front of me, and he is a editor in chief at a major publication that important people in Washington read, and I want to influence you. Like I'm not on one of these
You're influencing me. You're
chats.
succeeding. Get
I,
all in.
I haven't been invited to one of these group
Me either.
chats.
When you
Maybe
on
you can.
purpose or accidentally.
but you said you know a lot of the people on the chat.
is there like a power lefty group chat that you're in?
No, no. And
Isn't
here's
that
the thing.
interesting? Yeah, I guess maybe it's interesting to me that that this was sort of unique to this part of the right.
I do think so. After the Bernie campaign, or toward the end of it, I can't remember the timeline exactly. Again, don't this isn't a
Yeah.
deposition. But I was looped in by one of the sort of celebrity Bernie people, like a C-list actor. I
Mm-hmm.
don't mean that in a mean way, but just like a not very famous actress. Into one of these chats, and I had like Alyssa Milano on it and some other people. I think with the presumption that I was going to now join in with the all hands on deck Democrats, we're all Democrats effort to elect Joe
So you
Biden.
got thrown out of the group chat.
Yes.
That's kind of great.
I can't remember if I was actively thrown out or if everybody left but me or if I left. I honestly can't remember, but I remember I was in there only for a hot second. And
Group
it
chats
made me
do sort of carry a presumption that like we're all in this, like fundamentally we're on the same team.
yeah, it was a Twitter group actually, not a group chat.
Right. Oh yeah,
But
the DM groups, sure.
but I remembered
I'm sure
feeling like,
Elon
oh
is
gosh.
I'm sure Elon is mining that group's archive right now.
Well, I had no idea that things like that existed. And I remember my eyes
Yeah.
sort of opening in that moment to like, oh, they're coordinating. The libs are
Yeah,
coordinating.
totally.
Like the
I
other
remember that.
team and everything, as far as I can tell, on the left is extremely organic. I mean, occasionally I'll get added to some chat, again, Twitter group where there's not active participation. I think back in the day when there was more like resistance stuff happening, they'd be like, can you retweet this? Like people will ask me to retweet something here and there, but it is not coordinated. And most of these chats have very little activity happening in them as far as I can tell. And I have some hypotheses about the reasons for that. Genuine ideological authenticity on the left, a lack of moneyed support for sort of media campaigns. No one's going to get promised a job at like Center for American Progress if they're a good girl or boy and like tweet the right things out and say the right things about the president. You're not, unlike my predecessor on the Bernie campaign in 2016, I don't get a plum job at MSNBC for saying Joe Biden is right and good and he was never senile and he was never old until we were all allowed to acknowledge the truth. There's things like that the same motives don't exist for people on the left because we're critical of power. But also, I do think that there is some no true Scotsmaning that happens on the left that also balkanizes us in a way that I think is really harmful. I wished we could all get together behind a left candidate in the primary
Well, maybe you need to like start a top secret signal chat and figure it out.
Well, I can't get it's a Herculean effort to get some of these people to even be willing to talk to me on their podcast, much less my podcast, much less actually work together in a group chat. And frankly, I mean, there was a really instructive moment early in Biden's first year, which I won't get into any detail because the audience is probably tired of me talking about it, where there was a left push for the squad members to withhold their vote for Nancy Pelosi for speakership the way that Republicans later did for Kevin McCarthy, in exchange for, among other things, having a vote on Medicare for all. This was in the middle of the pandemic, right? Before the vaccines came out and 15 million people had just lost their employer-based health insurance. And some of us on the left came together over this issue, despite having certain ideological differences at the time, including a prominent comedian and podcaster named Jimmy Dore. And Jimmy Dore he's a more bombastic personality type. And there were enough people who disliked him personally that they were unwilling to pay attention to the effort at all. And that balkanized the left in a way that I think has endured.
Wow, Jimmy Dore is patient zero.
Yes, and people still, if I want to talk about force the vote, the first thing that they say, that's what the name of the movement was Jimmy Dore. But you allied with Jimmy Dore, but you were willing to talk to Jimmy Dore. So there is, I mean, there's like full on white nationalists on this chat, right? But they're all allowed to talk to each other without being sullied, at least in public opinion.
It is true that the right is very instrumental about like we're a big tent. Elon and Steve Bannon hate each other, but they're like willing to live together inside the tent in a very very explicit way, right? Like they will just sort of say that. Like, yeah, this is a big coalition. I hate these people, but we have shared interests, so we're going to stick it out for now. And that is something, I suppose that's like a long-term strength of the American right.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's also, I think, it's about power. Because there's people on the left right now.
Being about power.
that maybe they don't like each other, right? But so, for example, Cenk Uygur, who founded the Young Turks, which is probably the biggest left media outlet and the oldest, has gotten into some hot water recently for going into conservative spaces, sitting down with Charlie Kirk, and being very willing to form coalition over the issues that they agree with, which I don't
Yeah.
necessarily have a problem with. But his sort of openness to Charlie Kirk has been contrasted with the uncharitable way that he's treated some people within his own ideological network, including his employees at TYT. He recently fired one of the women who had disagreed publicly with him over his choice to sit down with Charlie Kirk. And as people analyze like why that is, you know, it does sort of start to feel like, well, is it that you're really open-minded, or are you willing to tolerate people who you think you can get something from? You know, Charlie Kirk has a huge audience. It looks good for me to sit down at some big conference and talk with him. It pays well to get invited to right-wing speaking gigs, as opposed to a smaller lefty YouTuber who you employ, but who's your subordinate, who you don't get anything from, who can't level you up in any way. I mean, that's not necessarily a judgment. I've gone on Candace Owens' show. I've gone on with the Charlie Kirk show. Flew out to Arizona to debate him because, especially in this media environment, yeah, one, I agree that you should engage with people who don't share your ideological priors, but you should do so willing to debate those issues, right?
Yeah.
And not just fluff each other up for the sake of growing your respective audiences. And so I think that's a fair critique potentially of some people. Like, is everyone in here really like getting along, or are they afraid to upset a literal billionaire who holds their fate in their hands?
Yeah, or I mean, actually, the thing that I think some people in those groups find kind of distasteful is there's a lot. And at this point, it's not Billionaire, it's Trump, and like, it's a space in which you can audition for jobs in the Trump administration. And if you like own Mark Cuban to the correct degree in the Signal Group, maybe David Sachs will tap you for a White House job, and that's, you know, I think that's, I mean, ultimately, like, yeah, the ultimate sort of center of power is always the White House, and people will always sort of orbit that and do and say whatever they need to do and say to wind up there, I think. And that's probably kind of a bipartisan truth.
I think that's true, which is why I was told I'll never work in this town again after I declined to endorse Joe Biden. And that has been true. Thankfully, we have independent media.
Well, thank you for, so I think I'm gonna have to.
Yeah, that's excellent timing.
Okay.
Ben Smith, I want to give you one more opportunity to talk about your podcast and let people know where they can find you on the internet and beyond.
Oh, yeah. Podcast is Mixed Signals from Semaphore Media. And it is like, it's about the stuff we were talking about earlier here. Just like, what the hell is happening in media and how does it work? And it's just, which is not always interesting, but at this moment is super interesting, at least to me.
Well, if you ever want a left Marxist take, I'm happy to join you.
All right.
Chew your ear off about more of this stuff, Ben.
May take you up on that. And yeah, and thanks. And then, you know, read Semaphore. Thank you, for having me on. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. Thanks to all of you for listening to Bad Faith. You know, you can get an extra episode every Monday by subscribing at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Take care of yourselves. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.